The problem doesn't lie there, because I have also seen in the Nika hospitals that suddenly people appear, suddenly enemies recognize that they were shooting at each other just a few hours ago, and then they are lying in the same hospital. And for us, that was absolutely no problem. I have even seen that enemies who live together in the same hospital for a certain time suddenly are no longer enemies. They suffer together and come to somehow different thought processes and so on. That is precisely the human solidarity that suffering somehow mobilizes. That is very important.
Die menschliche Solidarität, die das Leiden irgendwie mobilisiert, ist sehr wichtig.
Hallo zusammen, hier ist Pascal from Neutrality Studies.
Hello everyone, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with a fellow Swiss national, as I have with me the war surgeon and author, Dr. Flavio del Ponte. Mr. Del Ponte has been active since 1986 as a trainer for war surgeons at various locations, including on behalf of the Red Cross and the WHO, as Chief Medical Officer of the UN Mission in Africa, and as Medical Advisor at the Secretariat for UN Peacekeeping Operations in New York. From 1996 to 2009, he was also responsible for Switzerland's humanitarian aid in international dossiers on mine clearance and bioterrorism. This year, Mr. Del Ponte published a book about his work titled Dissonances, The Adventurous Life of a Surgeon with Passion. Today, we want to talk about the book and his experiences. Mr. Del Ponte, Flavio, welcome.
Flavio, willkommen.
Good day, Pascal. Nice to hear and see you.
Gleichfalls. Letzte Woche hat's nicht ganz klappen wollen.
Likewise. Last week it didn't quite work out, but today we have the connection. And I would like to first discuss your book with you, which has recently been released, or is just coming out now with West End Verlag. Why have you decided to package your experiences, which you have gathered over many years, into a book right now?
Gerade jetzt in ein Buch verpackt.
Well, I obviously know the answer better. It actually came from a personal crisis, not from the urge to tackle and look at my life, my past life. Because what I experienced back then, and I'm referring to February 24th, 2022, so 2020, the first images of the war in Ukraine that reached me, they horrified me. I couldn't believe my eyes. I see the tanks, I see the destruction that war brings, and so on. And I actually couldn't sleep anymore. My nightmares plagued me again. I say again because I have experienced situations like this over 30 years. And I thought to myself, now I want to tackle myself and ask questions and try to answer them. And that's when I turned to writing. Well, I'm not a writer, of course, but I have the habit, and you might have roughly the same, not so many, not from our activity. But these reports ended up in the drawers, even if they were of some importance. And in this sense, I thought now I want to tackle the matter better and more seriously. A self-analysis of the events. And that took about 2 years. After a year, the crisis in the Middle East came up again. And that further strengthened my motivation, because in previous decades I had also taken direct actions in the Middle East, especially in Palestine, in the name of Swiss Development Aid. And of course I also gathered a lot of frustrations when I consider the 70 years of the Palestine crisis. One can only marvel, and it is hopeless, I would say. But a glance did bring me a certain calm, and I was able to give myself some personal answers because my life has found a peculiar path. We can talk about that if it interests you or an audience. But in the book, I have singled out the period I want to analyze, starting from the day I had my medical diploma in hand to the day I retired. So that's about 40 years. And then I determined in periods. I started as a general surgeon in Switzerland and then moved towards traumatology, initially surgery related to humanitarian activities. From that came war surgery, a very important phase.
Es ist dann die Kriegschirurgie gekommen, die Phase, eine sehr wichtige. Und nachher ist noch die nächste war, also der Übergang.
And afterwards, there was the transition from war surgery and humanitarian surgery to development and cooperation. I was brought into it in the sense that the idea was, I saved my patients' lives, they are getting back on their feet, with or without a prosthesis. But what kind of life follows for these patients? It is a crossroads, a constant suffering. These are people who are affected for life. That's why the other issue that comes into play is that development cooperation can do a lot or accompany the next step. But then there are the global problems we all know: poverty, water scarcity, wars that further burden and sometimes destroy people. And then our planet is perishing because humans selfishly want to have everything, and so on and so forth. So the various issues, global issues that cause concern, they are all somehow in this track.
Die sind alle irgendwie gehen in diese Spur hinein.
Die wenigsten Leute können sich vorstellen.
Very few people can imagine what you have experienced as a war surgeon. How should a layperson envision war surgery? What were your experiences when you worked in the field and tried to save lives through surgery in war situations?
Leuten in Kriegssituationen das Leben zu retten durch Chirurgie.
Also, wenn ich einmal einen Vergleich zu meinen regulären...
So if I compare it to my regular surgical activity in Switzerland, I would say these missions always had a strong character. They demanded much more from me in terms of effort, concentration, and responsibility, but the human element was always very strong. I would say the effect of the Good Samaritan was always present.
War immer dabei, oder wenn man mit den Leuten arbeitet, etwas
When you work with people, do something for the benefit of the people, provide assistance, even in medicine and surgery, other aspects immediately come together, and the interaction between people always takes on a different dimension. So I have to say, for example, that there was never a problem in human contact with the patients or with the hospital staff. It's simply a different atmosphere. When you are so closely involved with suffering, certain inconveniences that we have in our hospitals do not exist. You are there, you know why, and everyone actually works with joy. And this atmosphere has always motivated me greatly.
Mit Freude eigentlich. Und diese Stimmung hat mich immer sehr motiviert. Ich muss sogar sagen, im Sinne, dass ich...
I must even say, in the sense that I have given something, I say I. But hundreds of surgeons here, for example in the Gaza Strip or elsewhere, who are now daily in horrible situations, without instruments, but are still there and working, they give something to the poor, the dying, especially the children. And it always comes back more to us as humans than we can give. That's the amazing thing. And I have several times had patients who I felt so sorry for because I had to amputate them, maybe 2 legs and so on. And I had a bit of sympathy for them. And when I wanted to express this to the patients in a supportive way, they often said to me, "But doctor, don't worry."
Haben Sie mir oft noch gesagt, aber Doktor, machen Sie sich keine Sorgen. Sie haben mir jetzt das Leben gerettet. Ich mache das schon weiter. Sie müssen...
You have saved my life now. I'll keep going. You don't need to express such concern now. We're just glad that you're still here, that you helped us, and that's how it should be. So this courage that came back has always impressed me somehow.
Was zurückkam, hat mich immer irgendwie beeindruckt.
Kannst du dir vorstellen, wie es im Moment sein muss?
Can you imagine what it must be like in Gaza at the moment, in this incredible situation? Because people are still living there, and they are getting injured, and they also have illnesses. Like everyone, and even there, someone is currently providing help, medical help, because the Palestinian territories are well trained in medicine. Gaza had a good medical sector and many trained professionals. Can you imagine what must be going on there right now?
Fachleute. Kannst du dir vorstellen, was dort im Moment vorgehen muss?
Das schon, aber das ist eine unheimliche Belastung.
That's true, but it's an incredible burden internally, emotionally for me these days. And especially with the realization that everything could be done if the necessary, absolutely necessary goods could arrive on site. There are, of course, medications, instruments, but everything that logistics requires in a hospital. And I remember exactly a special mission I had in Gaza, with the Palestinians, with the doctors. I always saw them as heroes, I would say, because they truly give their lives for the suffering and injured people, without being able to get anything back or demand anything.
Ohne was zurückhaben zu können und zu verlangen. Aber auch im Hauptspital von Gaza.
But also in the main hospital of Gaza, after we spent the whole morning having discussions and providing assistance, looking at how we could improve the situation, the level of surgery needed and performed. Afterwards, we had to walk a few hundred meters outside the hospital to eat. And there they told me, no, now we have to immediately move to the other sidewalk, because there we are under control and we can be tracked by rockets, which can follow person by person. And that was already 20 years ago. So the situation, as I naturally see now, Gaza is a heap of rubble, and people are simply dying. And they are day by day, and I would say, internationally, what happens? Uproar, not even, now people have gotten used to it. In the news, it's quickly mentioned at the end how many dead and how many injured there are and how many attacks have taken place. And as if it were a report on industrial activity, right? And the extent of the suffering of the population is given, which one cannot imagine. And that outrages me so much. I say, no, we cannot continue like this.
Wie gehst du, oder anders gefragt,
how did you, or put differently, when you were there, and in those war situations and worked as a peacekeeper, handle these situations differently than you do today? When you look at the situation from afar, how do you ensure it hasn't consumed you internally and hasn't destroyed you, having seen the suffering firsthand? How did you remain able to work?
Wie bist du arbeitsfähig geblieben?
Also das ist immer am Anfang eine
So, that has always been a difficult question at the beginning because we all have a certain battery potential, and this potential shrinks day by day in situations that are so serious. It was the same for me as it was for all other surgeons and personnel involved, that this enthusiasm to want and be able to help others unfortunately diminishes over time. This is because the mental and emotional strengths are suddenly not as present as they were at the beginning. But it turned out that it was observed that even a surgeon is not as capable after about 3 months. So the ICRC quickly recognized this. The missions lasted an average of 3 months.
Die Einsätze dauerten durchschnittlich 3 Monate. Und nach 3 Monaten hatte ich meine 10 Kilo Körpergewicht verloren.
And after 3 months, I had lost my 10 kilos of body weight. Emotionally always a bit battered in the end, with less and less enthusiasm, and having to tackle the same misery every day. But it was a privilege for me, and for all the other doctors in the same situation. We could get back on a plane and return to Switzerland. There I found my family, my surroundings, my good life, and everything. And then during that period, I could recharge my batteries so that after weeks or even months, I could sometimes start anew with renewed energy, will, and reflection. I was just amazed at how dynamically a person can change. And so I did, and that's what it became. The staff for the nurses and for certain other, let's say, hospital tasks can have their assignments last a bit longer. But after 3 months, you need to take a break and have a rest period. And that allowed me to always improve, actually, with more and better knowledge and an assessment of the situation which looked different each time. So excuse me, I need to turn off my phone here. Yes. So the fact that this rhythm was alternating was actually the reason why I and everyone else were able to persevere.
Hast du und die Leute, mit denen du zusammen...
Have you and the people you worked with, especially in the ICRC and also from the Swiss authorities, tried to bring about political changes in these conflicts? Or were you ever tempted to say, I need to approach these people who can alleviate this suffering beyond my surgical work?
außerhalb meiner chirurgischen Tätigkeit?
Also eine ganz heimtückische Frage, nicht?
So a very impressive question, isn't it? A dangerous path is emerging here. I believe, of course, we are in the privileged position of the doctor, able to develop. We had the privilege of having contact with the locals on every level, not just the patients, not just the minor officials, hospital staff, but also the population on the political level with the governors, and that was a very privileged situation. It always allowed us to truly understand what is going on, what is likely to happen in the near future. So, the information about the given situation was always very important, especially because of the security issue. Because, as you might not have read in the book yet, various incidents happened to me where things could have turned out differently and gone wrong. And several times I thought, you won't get out of this alive, this is what you wanted, sought, now it's simply over. But it wasn't over. And for reasons that weren't always clear to me, but I always somehow submitted to my fate, just as I chose my profession as a doctor. I knew that I just had to make myself available and practice my learned profession calmly as well as possible, and I would try to tackle or not solve the other things depending on the opportunity in the situation, but to accommodate them.
Was war denn deine prägendste?
What was your most formative experience? The one you would say advanced or changed you the most professionally?
Am meisten dann auch also weitergebracht oder verändert?
Das ist, wie du weißt, das Prinzip der Kriegschirurgie.
As you know, this is the principle of war surgery or humanitarian aid in emergencies, saving as many lives as possible in the shortest amount of time. And that naturally leads to situations where we, as medical staff, reach the limits of what is possible. And there we somehow need to understand where our limits are, and perhaps humbly take a step back now and then. Let me give an example. If you work in the operating room for 10, 12, 13 hours non-stop, like a good athlete, mechanically, and if I as a surgeon can no longer handle the instruments, I can no longer operate, right?
Anfassen kann ich doch nicht mehr operieren, oder? Und deswegen gibt's da Grenzen, die man absolut beachten.
And that's why there are limits that absolutely must be observed. And even the so-called energy that one has is not infinite. So you have to somehow make thoughtful calculations. What can you do? What can we do? And what can't we do? So humility and clarity of the situations are needed. But of course, each time it's something different, different situations. And I would say the human ability to adapt is incredibly large. Depending on the motivations, we have strengths and potentials that we wouldn't have any idea about, but certainly not. That must be said.
Ist das auch einer der Gründe, warum
Is that also one of the reasons why you titled your book Dissonances? You use this metaphor of dissonance or consonance in music quite a lot. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Könntest du darauf noch etwas eingehen?
Ja, ich könnte zu lange vielleicht darüber sprechen, aber ja.
Yes, I might talk about it for too long and play the philosopher a bit. I've always had the impression that when dissonance approaches, you somehow sense it in advance. Then there's a moment where you have to give in, and the solution comes on its own. And this moment often made me realize only in hindsight, that was a dissonance. The moment is simply the action, and so on.
Das war eine Dissonanz. Im Moment ist einfach die Aktion und so. Aber es sind Schlüsselsituationen, die plötzlich...
But there are key situations that suddenly bring something new into play. I have an example in the book that has occupied me and where I haven't come to a solution. An international conference that is on the brink of failure. The two also abandoned treaties, international treaties, etc. These are two disputing parties, and it doesn't come to a common conclusion. The so-called final declaration is simply a construct that often has nothing to do with reality. It is often purely political. But there are conferences where suddenly, even though everything seems hopeless, everything turns around within hours, completely flips. And before that, There was dispute and disagreements and dissatisfaction. Suddenly the mood changes, and within hours a decision is reached.
Streitigkeiten und Unzufriedenheit. Plötzlich hat die Stimmung geändert und innerhalb von Stunden kommt man endlich zu einem Entschluss. Es ist sicher oft ein Kompromiss, aber die Konferenz ist nicht gescheitert.
It is certainly often a compromise, but the conference did not fail because some solutions were still shared and openly expressed. And what constitutes this trigger moment? I don't know. But surely human emotionality plays a role, over which no one really has the upper hand or a fixed rule. Emotionality is individually active in every person at all times, and almost with its own force that comes from within.
Und fast mit einer eigenen Kraft, nicht das von innen kommt.
Dein Buch beschäftigt sich zu einem guten Teil dann auch mit der Entwicklung.
Your book deals to a large extent with the development of what can be called war medicine or humanitarian medicine, and also with the problem that this field of study still cannot be learned in the way you would like. Or at least that's how I understood you. Could you perhaps explain to us why humanitarian medicine should be perceived separately or as a specialty within medicine? What is the difference from a regular medical degree program?
Was ist der Unterschied zu einem normalen Medizinstudiengang?
Ja, also ich habe nicht allein, aber mit vielen Freunden.
Yes, so I, not alone but with many friends, have dealt with this problem and actually seen in the last 70 years the need for humanitarian medicine. I now call it humanitarian medicine because the concept is quite vague, and somehow the entire content should finally be dissected. It has been done, but it is not structured. These are pieces of knowledge that are distributed across various universities, states, military organizations, and so on.
Also, jeder Staat spricht von humanitärer Medizin, aber was das beinhaltet.
Every state talks about humanitarian medicine, but what that entails is not exactly known. Even more so with humanitarian surgery, and that is exactly the same situation. The various states with war experience also have experience with which surgical techniques lead to good results today. But most states, even the small ones that are in a state of war, have wars and they're injured, who are treated but do not heal. This is a burden that leaves a country with an additional strong public health liability for decades. And we said to ourselves, we can provide our doctors to help alleviate human suffering by offering a different path, the necessary medically adapted training.
Adaptierte Ausbildung offerieren können. Und das kann in der Medizin, wird das oft gemacht.
And this can be done in medicine. It is often done. Science provides new insights, which are incorporated into specific areas of medicine. And for example, in Switzerland, we have the list of medical specialties. 20, 30 years ago, there were so many. Now there are twice as many. So within internal medicine, cardiology was separated, and then other subspecialties were created. It would certainly be nice and perhaps also necessary as a solution to make so-called humanitarian medicine a subspecialty of general medicine. But the training should, of course, be at a university academic level and should also constantly have contact with research, as is the case everywhere.
Die Ausbildung sollte natürlich auf universitätsakademischem Niveau und sollte auch ständig Kontakt mit der Forschung, wie es überall der Fall ist, nicht? Und dieses Gespür, als mit meinen Freunden die Lehraufträge.
And this intuition, as with my friends who had teaching assignments at important universities and fully grasped this necessity, they also did not succeed. And in Switzerland, we then arrive in Geneva, where the word humanity, even nowadays together with the European Master in Disaster Medicine, in the early years with other colleagues, I later joined them, so united primarily with Belgium, the University of Brussels, and in Italy at Novara, the first online masters in medicine. Back then, we still referred to it as disaster medicine. And in Switzerland, with a little trick, I also added disaster and military medicine.
Habe ich noch dazu Katastrophen- und Militärmedizin. Das bedeutet, dass die humanitäre Medizin liegt eigentlich in der Schweiz unter dem Departement der
This means that humanitarian medicine is actually under the Department of Foreign Affairs, the EDA, in Switzerland. In contrast, disaster and military medicine are situated within the military, where a lot of funds flow. We combined our efforts, and together with the Chief Medical Officer of the Army, who unfortunately passed away 10 years ago, Divisionary Giampiero Lupi founded a Swiss academy from the European Academy on the Internet, where Swiss universities, not all of them yet, established this academy for humanitarian medicine in this field.
Eine humanitäre Medizin gegründet.
The project initially had a lot of hopes, cooperation, and excellent collaboration, but it later stalled because the promoters have either passed away or retired, like myself. To properly realize and lead such a project to success, it requires not only many resources for sustainability, but also the involvement of all necessary specialists. These were available, but as soon as the resources from the state, and in this case, the military, were withdrawn with the departure of key individuals, the priorities changed. Unfortunately, the project has come to a standstill and was abandoned. In my book, I tried to leave a clear message to all doctors and students about how wonderful and necessary it is to engage in medicine, particularly humanitarian medicine, and perhaps even dedicate one's life to it. In the future, this could become much better, more regulated, and more common than before. Not as an academic path, but as a professional one for a Swiss doctor, this should work wonderfully. This is a doctor who can practice their medical profession in the humanitarian field with international and national organizations. And I still hope that over time, this type of medicine will become so necessary that it cannot be overlooked. Every day we see how hundreds, thousands are not cared for, die, suffer, and so on. But well, we are getting there.
Sterben, leiden und so, aber gut, da kommen wir in eine andere Diskussion. Es ist nicht nur, weil die Medizin, die humanitäre Medizin nicht da ist, sondern die Gründe sind dann anderswo. Und da muss ich dir nicht mehr sagen bezüglich.
Nein, die humanitäre Medizin wird leider gebraucht, weil die humanitäre
No,
Politik.
humanitarian medicine is unfortunately needed because humanitarian politics has failed. That's the terrible part. But still, we have to live with this circumstance. It's a fact that, unfortunately, we have banned war, but we have never gotten rid of it. And that's why people die and suffer from war. My question to you, if you had a lecture hall of 100 students in front of you, all studying medicine, and saying, "We want to do what you did, Flavio, we want to do that too." This course of study doesn't exist. But what should we do to be able to help like you? Practically speaking, what do you recommend?
Ganz praktisch, was empfiehlst du?
Also im Buch habe ich diesbezüglich versucht, möglichst
In the book, I tried to focus as much as possible and provide some advice in response to this question. Because I've been asked this question so often, right? By young people who have an inclination and think we want to do something in this direction. And I believe that the intuition, this affectivity, is always present, but it needs some guidance that must be given. And I gave about 10 tips to make the answer easier.
Im Sinne von die Antwort zu erleichtern, oder? Es ist so, die Leute, die mit dem Enthusiasmus ist nichts
With enthusiasm alone, nothing is accomplished. But one of the most important points, the first one, is every medical professional, whether a doctor, nurse, or specialist in another field, must first achieve the highest level of professional capacity for themselves. You cannot send people with good intentions into the world to help. So, a medical professional must be trained. Training in one's own country is the be-all and end-all. After that, one should take advantage of the opportunities that do exist, even if they are not so regulated and not so consistent over time. You can establish these contacts with the humanitarian world, and I would initially prefer that one gains a small amount of experience to test the waters.
Eine kleine Erfahrung eben macht, zu prüfen, ob man irgendwie, man spürt, dass man die notwendige Formamentis hat, diesen Weg zu
Formament It has what it takes to go this way. But I also warn against the so-called tenders made by international organizations like the UN. People are being sought, but one should not get their hopes up too much, because for a position that is officially advertised, thousands of applications are received. So that is not the way. But through personal contacts that one makes with foundations, with NGOs, smaller NGOs, organizations, or social movements, one can always get a bit further with human connections. I hope that one day this main problem will be solved. Doctors want to practice medicine in a humanitarian environment and stay there for a lifetime. We, our Switzerland, should be able to prepare and offer this path. I come back, yes, for this purpose I have often, and also in the book, when I was in the operating room, looked at these patients, not children injured by mines and so on, what my eyes have seen. But every time there was such a wound inside, you can observe that. But you can't see that a human can do something like that to another human. They have absolutely no responsibility. What has a child? How can a child be wounded like that? And I took some photos, of course. It was too much for my nerves. But with the idea that one day maybe I can do something in the sense of something else. And I want these photos as a witness to a situation that you never see and that you don't want to see.
Eine Situation, die man nie sieht und die man nicht sehen will. Und deswegen habe ich ein paar Bilder ausgesucht und am Schluss des...
And that's why I selected a few pictures. And at the end of the book, in the German version, these photos are printed in black and white and small, almost as if they don't want to be shown. But in the Italian version, I have them in large format and in color, and the description is added at the beginning, explaining why I want these pictures to be shown. Because I think that anyone who sees these pictures can no longer look away and say it doesn't concern them. The feelings that are stirred inside do have some sort of outlet, a release, all in a good sense, of course. And that's why I insisted that these pictures should be included. We will see what effect that has, but I firmly believe in this liberation of inner forces, reactions in a positive sense.
Darf ich dich hierzu fragen? Und es geht in das Problem.
May I ask you about this? And this goes into the problem of media coverage of wars and conflicts. But there's this thing, you don't see these images, as you say. So you hear reports about the war, you hear numbers that, as you say, come across almost industrially. But the images, a missing leg, or a child bleeding out on the street, no editor shows that. The news doesn't show that. It's not possible on YouTube either. That would damage their protection clauses, and then they would say, no, you can't show that. No company would want to advertise with us anymore. Should that be changed? Should we say, yes, these images must go around the world, and these images must be shown, just to make people aware of how bad the situation is? Or would you be against showing the suffering as it happens?
Oder wärst du dagegen, das Leiden so zu zeigen, wie es stattfindet?
In
my opinion, I somehow told myself after seeing this, I think the whole world should see it. You can't hide it, because this is the real reality. The other stuff that comes on TV, the reports, and so on, all mixed up in the news. We've gotten used to hearing things that leave us absolutely indifferent. The number of injured, the dead, how it happened, how bad it is, and so on. This is this virtual reality that feels so distant from humanity to me. And I always say it in a banal way, it would have a little digression. Netanyahu, if one of his sons were to experience the pain, the situation he causes 100-fold, 1,000-fold, if it were in his family, how would he react? I believe that the grasp of reality, which is not sweet and contains repulsive elements, must, or when a person sees it, they will have to think differently. And precisely the matter-of-factness with which today the escalation in war situations, the human suffering that the civilian population takes on and absorbs, is viewed, is simply too great. Something has to happen there.
Das die zivile Bevölkerung übernehmen oder einkassiert. So, ist einfach zu groß, nicht? Und etwas muss da geschehen. Und ich gebe meinen kleinen Teil und ich hoffe, dass
I contribute my small part, and I hope that a movement like after the Second World War, this pacifism or movements against war, which shook the whole world, will happen again. People said never again wars. But today, all of that has been forgotten. How people disregard history and reject the insights from the past as waste is terrible, I think. So morality and certain principles, ethical ones, must certainly be part of these international agreements, which are so trampled on and ignored today, like international humanitarian law, human rights, and so on, that they are just like waste paper. What is happening in this world? Can we as Swiss simply allow this? And then you might come with your keyword neutrality. Can we still achieve something with our neutrality? We have reached a turning point. Now an earthquake must happen.
und jetzt muss richtig ein Erdbeben stattfinden. Also die Schweiz, das habe ich in den letzten Tagen noch.
So Switzerland, I officially said this in the last few days because I have nothing to lose. I can openly say what I think, politically, not apolitically, but my opinion as a doctor from my experiences, I can say that. And I would say Switzerland also has to decide today which side it wants to stand on. The side of good or evil, suffering or life. And now I'll stop, you understand me perfectly, but it's a moment where a decision has to be made. And also with our neutrality, we have an instrument, but it can be manipulated, it can be altered, and this concept is so fragile. But I think with your mandate here, you can make an important contribution. And maybe something else that comes to mind. I'm not so surprised anymore when I hear former politicians or current politicians who have influence, and I could name all the names. Even former federal presidents who somehow feel ashamed today of how Switzerland presents itself to the public, what image Switzerland gives in public. And it's a bit harshly put, but also those who have written books, if you read them, some more diplomatically, others less so, but we are then here in a dichotomy or a polarization, but today we need to bring some clarity to this.
Aber darf ich dich dazu jetzt fragen, weil du sagst, einerseits man darf...
May I ask you about this now, because you say, on one hand, one must not support evil, and on the other hand, neutrality, which is not only used by Switzerland in international politics, but also by the ICRC, and to some extent, must be inherent in medicine. As a doctor, you care about the well-being of the patient, regardless of whether the patient is Palestinian, Israeli, Russian, or Ukrainian. Right? How should one deal with this? How do you, as a doctor, say, yes, I recognize what is politically wrong, but I will provide help to anyone who needs it? Do you have a recommendation?
Lassen, der Hilfe braucht. Hast du eine Empfehlung?
Nein, aber ich glaube, der Weg ist schon gesetzt worden, auch vom IKRK.
No, but I believe the path has already been set, also by the ICRC in Switzerland in the past, namely that human suffering must be addressed, and efforts must be made to alleviate, reduce, and neutralize human suffering. But in this sense, the problem does not lie there. Because I have also seen in non-war hospitals, suddenly people appear, suddenly enemies recognize each other. A few hours ago they were shooting at each other, and then they are in the same hospital.
Gegenseitig geschossen und dann liegen sie im gleichen Spital. Und für uns war absolut kein Problem.
And for us, that was absolutely no problem. I have even seen that enemies who lived together in the same hospital for a certain period suddenly are no longer enemies. They suffer together and come to different thought processes and so on. That is precisely the human solidarity that suffering somehow mobilizes, and it's very important. I could give endless examples that show something positive.
Beispiele geben, die im positiven Sinn etwas zeigen, oder?
Gib noch ein Beispiel, ein positives Beispiel, wie...
Give another example, a positive example, of how to rehumanize war in order to alleviate suffering.
Ich glaube, dass es geht schlussendlich, dass die Leute müssen...
I believe that ultimately it's about people having to live together who might not be together because of the situation. Namely, dialogue, the panacea today. Dialogue. But dialogue is not just about talking to each other or scolding each other or whatever, but dialogue is also about being together, living together for a certain time. And I have always wondered about the so-called CNN effect. CNN is immediately on site when something happens. And then the politicians come, make their statements and so on. And then after a few hours, everything is over and forgotten.
Und dann, nach ein paar Stunden, ist alles vorbei und vergessen, nicht? Hingegen Leute, die sich in ihrem Leben bewegen, von einem Ort zum anderen, mit anderen Leuten
in their lives, moving from one place to another, working with other people, and maintaining a dialogue, a real human dialogue. That's why NGOs, and also earlier the missionary hospitals or activities which were referred to at the time as being in the Third World, were about going to the Third World to help. Well, that's another matter. But nowadays we have the means to support and engage in the so-called fraternization actions. Also scientifically, at the so-called congresses, where specialists come together, there are always moments of cultural mixing, language, and so on, which bring about something particularly new. I'll give a concrete example.
Ich mache einen konkreten Beispiel. Mit der Partnership für Peace, das die Schweiz auch unterschrieben hat, ich weiß jetzt nicht mehr, wurde ein Joint Medical Committee.
A joint medical committee was formed. The term joint means that it leads to the official civilian medicine working with military medicine, as NATO is, of course, military. This joint medical committee met once a month in Brussels. I was present at the first meeting as a representative of the civilian side. Robert Feldhans, at that time it was Dr. Eichenberger, was the military representative. And it was so remarkable to see how a dialogue also took place with the Russians. They were also involved. Back then, Poland and the other states were involved, defined on the other side. But as doctors, with the greatest joy, exchanging our insights and data. It always led to friendships. You could talk and debate with each other, and it was very popular, right? That was an example for me to show that through dialogue, coexistence, collaboration, and also joint research or embarking on new adventures, humanity comes together.
Das koalisiert die Menschheit zusammen.
Weißt du, es ist ein Teil der Kriegslogik, dass Leute...
You know, it's part of the logic of war that people are driven apart, and that it's said you must not speak with the enemy. You must not engage at all. And what you're saying is the opposite of that. No, you must, especially when at war, work with the enemy. Please. From your experience, you would also say that's right. You must work with those you hate.
Das ist richtig. Man muss arbeiten mit denen, die man hasst.
Yes, even if they have a different opinion, even if they belong to a different religion, naturally a different version and cultural attitude, but people everywhere have the same basic reason, or the principles of humanity are the same for everyone.
I absolutely agree with you. For that reason, the most important thing we can do is to resist this division of the other parts of our shared humanity. Flavio, people who want to read more about your experiences can get your book now in German and also in Italian, right? Is it available in other languages as well?
No, I come from the Italian part of Switzerland. I believe the book should be translated into French as soon as possible, but we'll see. It's not so easy. Currently, it is available in Italian and German. And I must say, in Germany, even in the short time at the Frankfurt Fair, I met very interesting public figures. It really inspired me. You can actually do something. And you are also one of these pioneers of the new generations. You must have in your hands the...
Ihr müsst ja in den Händen die Zukunft nehmen, richtig und führen, nicht vorbereiten und führen. Und das ist eben, wenn man mit den Leuten sprechen kann und sich...
And in debates, you learn an incredible amount and come to a better understanding of reality.
Damit bin ich mit dir absolut einverstanden.
I absolutely agree with you on that, dear listeners. Something can be done. It's not the end of the world. You just have to be able to imagine something and be willing to work together. Flavio del Ponte, thank you very much for your time today.
Herzlichen Dank für deine Zeit heute.
Danke.
Thank you, Pascal Lataz, and good luck with your work.
Arbeit.